Why don't I do it that way all the time? Yikes! Should you buy a vintage CD player? Should you buy a CD player at all? Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Today I want to talk about CD players. Let's start with the second question first. What's the use of a CD player when you can stream lossless files? So let's say you think owning the physical media is worth the price of the CDs. With a CD drive on my computer, Audacity, network attached storage or NAS, a streamer, and a DAC, I could listen to the music from my CDs without a CD player. That is, in fact, how I often listen to my CDs and even my vinyl. And this system has distinct advantages of portability, ease of use, and fidelity. Digital files are easy to move. Since I'm just moving ones and zeros, I may not even need a physical storage device to effect the transfer of files from my work computer to my home, for example. Even if I use a thumb drive, phone, laptop, or external drive to transport the files, the size of the device and the sizes of the transfer are nearly independent. When the hard drive connected to my streamer at home got corrupted, I had to take that drive to work, reformat it, and rewrite my whole digital library to it. That drive took up less space in my bag than 4 or 5 CDs. My standard operating procedure is to rip CDs on my computer at work, copy the files to my laptop, and copy them to my NAS when I get home. The most cumbersome part of the process is lugging the CDs back and forth in my backpack. Sometimes, though, I do the ripping at home so I don't have to move the CDs. In fact, why don't I do it that way all the time? But I don't even need to carry the files on a device. I can move them over the network. Digital files are easy to play. At work, I just drag and drop. Easy peasy. At home, I can play the files on my streamer by touching the screen on my phone or iPad. On the iPad, I even have CD-size album art and extensive liner notes. And the fidelity of streaming files is arguably better than is possible with a CD player. Hypothetically, I could use DACs of equal quality to play files and CDs. Hell, with a CD transport, I could use the same DAC for files and CDs. With both formats, I might need to worry about the same digital noise finding its way into the analog signal. But with the CD player or transport, I'd also have to contend with the noise produced by the physical mechanism. I mean, let's face it, CD mechanisms are noisy. Not very noisy, but they do make noise. Some are noisier than others, but none are absolutely silent. Now, unlike surface noise on vinyl, CD mechanism noise doesn't get louder when we turn up the volume. But it's still often audible during particularly quiet passages in the music. With files on a drive, we can eliminate mechanism noise altogether with a solid-state drive, or SSD. But even with a hard disk drive, or HDD, the file is loaded into RAM, and the drive then becomes silent. So why do I have several CD players? Moreover, why are all my CD players from the last century? Okay. I said I'd start with why any CD player might be worth owning and using. CD players have distinct advantages of portability, ease of use, and fidelity. Wait. Those are the same things I said were better with digital files. Remember, I premised these advantages on starting with buying the physical media. The process of going from CDs to files and moving those files around requires significant effort, and serving and streaming files can have glitches and hiccups. Moving CDs is as simple as picking them up and carrying them. I don't need to worry about my Wi-Fi being down or simply overtasked by other tasks and users in my home. I don't need to worry about updating the VPN on my laptop or phone, or mapping the drive on my NAS to another device to effect a file transfer. And whereas CDs can get damaged and unplayable, they're pretty durable and will play perfectly if the user exercises simple care and cleanliness. Hard drives, in contrast, routinely fail or become corrupted. Yes, you can minimize the chance of failure by simply not willy-nilly unplugging the server, but failures can still occur without a loss of power, and home power outages, while uncommon, are not rare. So, now we're talking RAID arrays and UPSs or UPSs as necessary for ensuring the integrity of the music library. If these terms are unfamiliar, RAID, R-A-I-D, stands for Redundant Array of Inexpensive or Independent Disks. And UPS, UPS, stands for Uninterruptible Power Supply. A RAID, most simply, keeps more than one copy of your files in case one copy is lost. An UPS is a battery backup that kicks in instantly if mains power goes out. So, now we've got more devices, more cost, and more complexity, unless we can and want to rely on an independent backup or restoring files from the original CDs. From the original CDs. Yikes! I rely on my copy at work, where the files are backed up and the computer has an UPS. What happens when I retire? I'll have to have those things and maintain those things at home. At this point, CDs and CD players are looking pretty robust, never mind portable. Power goes out? Dang, my CD player doesn't work without power. I guess I've still got my smartphone to keep me entertained. And CD players are pretty easy to use. Press the button to open the tray, open the jewel case, take out the CD, place it on the tray, and press the play button. Yes, I have to physically manipulate some things, but if I can follow these steps, I can use any CD player. Playing files requires learning a user interface. Mostly those are easy, but my wife and son don't use my streamer. Come to think of it, they don't use CD players either. Okay then, but my 95-year-old mother used one of my CD players to play the small selection of CDs I put out for her when she was here. And she only had to ask how to do it a couple of times before she got it. And the player never glitched out, and there was never a long enough delay between hitting play and the sound of music to make her wonder whether she was doing it right. Playing CDs on a CD player is fundamentally easy. Yes, playing files offers a kind of convenience that CD players can't match, but the streamers can't match the robust simplicity of CD players. So what about fidelity? How is that an advantage of CD players? It's like I said before, with simple care and cleanliness, a CD player will play the CD as soon as I hit play, and it won't stop or pause unless I hit the corresponding buttons. My streamer often stops playing after a few seconds of the first song I play, and doesn't resume playing for tens of seconds. I know, first world problems. I'm just saying, the worst fidelity is no fidelity. That is, no music playing when I want to hear music. That kind of glitched out gap in playback can be annoying as hell, and it's something I never have to worry about with CDs. So what about vintage CD players? Why would I want an old CD player with old technology and aging mechanisms? Aging mechanisms are problematic, but vintage CD players are appealing to me. I still use the first CD player I bought used in the early 90s.
And you are all... We don't even come to see our own, man.
It's a 1988 made in Belgium Magnavox CDB 582, aka Philips CD 582. On the one hand, it is BPC. black plastic crap. On the other hand, it features a TDA 1541A multi-bit DAC chip that has held its value to this day. And there is a bunch of information online about restoring and modifying this player and others using the same chipset and mechanism. I have 3 of this model now, and another, a Rotel RCD855, that uses the same chipset and mechanism. The DAC in the Rotel is better than the DAC in the Magnavox. But didn't I say it used the same chipset? Do you really think DAC quality is determined by the chipset? The chipset is a factor, sure. Otherwise, the TDA 1541A based chipset wouldn't have the desirability that it does. But implementation on the digital side matters, and so does the analog side. The Rotel has bigger, higher quality capacitors on the data buffer pins. For players with this chipset, replacing or augmenting those capacitors is a common mod. I've done that with a Rotel for a friend and with one of my Magnavoxes. The Rotel has Rubicon Blackgate electrolytic capacitors in the analog stage, whereas the Magnavox has mostly generic electrolytics except for Nichicon Muse bipolar caps on the outputs. For my friend's Rotel, I replaced the Blackgates, some of which were out of spec, with Elna Silmic 2s. In 2 of my Maggies, I replaced the electrolytics in the analog stage and throughout. The Rotel features NE5532 op-amps, whereas the Maggie has inferior op-amps not worth mentioning. In both Rotel and Maggie, I've replaced the signal op-amps with NJM 2068s. Those aren't dramatically superior to 5532s, but do have lower noise specs. Other modders often use pricier boutique op-amps that I'm not convinced offer significant improvement over the 2068, especially for the price. But others disagree, and that's cool. Modding the op-amps typically includes installing sockets so that the op-amps can be easily replaced without desoldering and resoldering. Once modded with sockets, users can effectively tailor the sound to their taste. I've got a couple of CD players that I use without any modification, but that's not to say they required zero work. One is the Rotel RCD855. The same model I restored and modified for a friend. All I did to mine was to clean old grease off the drawer mechanism, apply new grease, and put the drawer belt in hot water to rejuvenate the rubber. One of these days I should replace the electrolytic capacitors, including those Blackgates. But for now it sounds great and functions smoothly.
Bring it on!
My most recently acquired CD player is a Sony X77ES that I got for $25. Its drawer didn't function properly, and it may have had some issues with playback. Opening it up revealed a bunch of rust and corrosion, but it all appeared to be environmental, maybe from sitting and operating in a garage without climate control, and not from components, especially electrolytic capacitors, gone bad. This player is massive, and it's packed with high-end components. Its DAC is an early single-bit or Delta Sigma version, rather than multi-bit like the Rotel. I can't really speak to the relative merits of multi-bit and Delta Sigma DACs. Each type has its following. I have heard, I believe it was on Hans Beekhuizen's channel, that the differences in DAC audio quality are largely, if not entirely, due to different analog stages. I'm not trying to argue that point, except to say that the analog stage really matters. Moreover, we've been converting bits to signal since the early 80s, and I think Hans is probably right. The Sony has a beast mode analog stage. Plus, it's seriously built like a tank. It has the heft of a boat anchor. The mechanism is also high-end. The mass of the chassis and the isolation of the mechanism make for superior playback stability relative to the Magnavox, so that having the Sony sit on my dresser is no big deal. Opening and closing drawers, which made the Magnavox skip, has no apparent effect on playback with the Sony. In short, this was a high-end player in the early 90s, and it's still a high-end player today. But instead of paying over $1,000, I paid $25 and put some work into cleaning up and painting over corrosion and cleaning and lubricating the mechanism. I even gave it wooden side pieces, whereas it would have originally sold with optional fake wood veneered side pieces. Mine are veneered with real cherry. So, despite the blackface, it does have a vintage look, and it definitely has vintage heft. The downsides and pitfalls of vintage CD players aren't the old technology, but rather the aging player, including the aging mechanism. Like I said, my Sony had spent long enough in a poor environment to suffer significant damage. I was lucky to find that the damage was reversible. But what if the laser had burned out? The lasers in these Sonys are known to go bad, and replacement lasers can only be scavenged from another player. However, many players with apparently failed lasers actually have other problems that prevent good lasers from doing their jobs. And that brings me to the more general issue with vintage CD players. They have mechanisms with moving parts that can malfunction due to wear and/or contamination. Some problems can be fixed, and some are even easy to fix, but other problems are difficult or impossible to solve. And as with any vintage gear, electronic components do go bad, especially electrolytic capacitors, and old units may simply sustain damage that is beyond repair. Same old song as with all vintage gear. Having bought several vintage CD players in the past, even recently, how do I feel now about buying vintage CD players? I feel better about vintage CD players than I do about vintage cassette decks, but some of the pitfalls are similar. I'd put vintage CD players well above vintage cassette decks and significantly below vintage turntables, which are probably worth their own video. Above vintage turntables are speakers, and highest are amps, receivers, and preamps. For example, I did a full resto mod of a Magnavox CDB582, but then it still had problems with playback and mechanism noise. Eventually, I cannibalized the mechanism from another unit, and that fixed the problem. Only now I have another player that doesn't work. Maybe someday I'll do a deep dive into the mechanism and get it working, or maybe I'll get another replacement mechanism. When I bought those two players, I had planned to do the resto mod work and resell them. Now I think that maybe that was a bad plan. Those mechanisms are old and just won't last forever. And CD player mechanisms just aren't as robust as in turntables. Plus, vintage turntables have no signal electronics downstream of the cartridge. So old turntables can lose some functionality, such as with the automatic features, and still retain some value as long as the platter turns at the right speed and the tone arm moves as it should. Cartridges can malfunction, but they can be replaced. CD players, in contrast, do a lot of signal processing, and the processing relies on delicate and precise mechanisms and lasers that can fail. A lot of vintage players eventually turn into paperweights, or in the case of these Sonys, boat anchors. If you're considering the purchase of a vintage CD player, do consider the risk, especially if you don't have a repair tech available. I would generally advise against having a vintage CD player shipped. Hard knocks and vibrations can play havoc with those delicate mechanisms. As for me, I'll stay on the lookout for good deals on high-quality vintage CD players, even with the intention of restoring them and selling locally. I don't want to receive or send any via shipping. I think CD players are worth having, and high-end players of the past can hold their own with high-end players of the present. If you can find a good deal on a high-end vintage CD player, I think you should go for it, as long as the risk and likely cost of repair are factored into the quality of the deal. For example, a 2-hour round-trip drive and $25 for a Sony X77ES with issues, plus $25 for a Kenwood KA9100 with issues, plus a bunch of CDs and DVDs and a crappy Blu-ray player thrown in? No-brainer. Totally worth the time, effort, and expense. This thing sounds amazing. I just hit the big score. Guy Mark, retired guy, pretty much confined to a wheelchair, sold me his Kenwood amplifier. It's a KA9100. And his Sony CD player. It's a CDP X77ES. And like his entire CD collection, his whole entire DVD collection, threw in a cheap Blu-ray player. Yeah, he just wanted $50. I actually did try to talk him into taking more, but that's all he wanted. He just wanted to see his sweet gear go to somebody who would appreciate it. So anyway, I'm in Sweet Home, Oregon. Can't stop in Sweet Home without coming to the A&W. So that's where I'm at right now.
The baton has been passed.
Oh, I missed it.
Thank you.
How much more would I have been willing to pay? $100? Sure. $200? Probably. $300? Maybe not. I'd have to check eBay for parts-only selling prices. Did you like the video? Was it helpful? Food for thought? Let me know by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. You know the drill. Have a great day, everybody. Talk to you again soon.